During the Sunday Mass, the priest suddenly stopped. He turned toward the congregation, pointed at a young woman, and said with a firm voice, "You will not receive communion today, not dressed like that." The church fell silent. All eyes turned toward her. Her hands trembled. She felt her chest tighten, her heart racing as if it would burst. Whispers spread through the pews. Some frowned, others looked away. She wanted to disappear, but there was no escape. Why had he done that? She had never spoken to him before. What sin could possibly justify such humiliation? What happened next was even worse, and it changed her life forever. Comment: is this fair? I want to hear your thoughts. I still remember the exact moment everything began to unravel. Until that day, the church had always been my safe place, the place where the smell of candles and polished wood meant peace, not judgment. But after what happened, the same pews that once comforted me started to feel like they were pressing down on my chest. That Sunday morning, I got dressed carefully. Not because I wanted to draw attention, but because I believed showing up to church was a way of showing respect. I put on a simple skirt, modest in length, and a blouse that was light but proper. I brushed my hair, tied it back, and slipped into my shoes. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just me. When I walked into the church, I greeted a few familiar faces. Some responded politely, some just nodded without warmth, but I thought little of it. The organ was playing softly. Children were whispering near the front, and the scent of fresh flowers decorated the altar. I breathed in, hoping for a calm service. But midway through the Mass, everything shifted. The priest stopped speaking. The silence was sudden, like someone had cut the thread of the ceremony. Everyone froze, waiting. Then he lifted his hand, pointed directly at me, and in front of the entire congregation said, "You will not receive communion today. Not dressed like that." My body stiffened. The words pierced through me like knives. For a second, I thought I hadn't heard him right, that maybe he was speaking to someone else. But no, his eyes stayed fixed on me, stern and unyielding. A wave of heat rushed through me. My hands trembled on my lap. My throat closed up. I felt every gaze around me land on my skin like sharp needles. Some people whispered. Others raised their brows. I lowered my head, but that only made me feel more exposed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought the sound would echo through the whole church. I couldn't breathe. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. I looked down at my clothes, my skirt, my blouse, ordinary, clean, modest by any measure. But at that moment, under his accusation, it felt as if I were naked, stripped of dignity in front of everyone. I could feel tears burning at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. If I cried, they would say it was guilt. If I protested, they would call it defiance. So I sat still, crushed in silence. When the service ended, I tried to slip out quickly. My steps were shaky, but I forced myself forward. I heard murmurs behind me. She should have known better. What was she thinking, dressing like that? The words followed me out the door like shadows that refused to detach from my feet. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the priest's finger pointing at me, his voice ringing out for all to hear. I replayed the moment over and over, trying to understand what I had done to deserve such public humiliation. In the quiet of my room, I opened a small blue notebook I often used for thoughts I didn't dare speak aloud. My hands still shook as I wrote, "Today I became invisible and exposed at the same time. Everyone saw me, but no one truly looked at me. My dignity was taken in a single sentence." The following week, I dreaded Sunday. My stomach twisted at the thought of walking back into that place, but a part of me insisted I couldn't let fear dictate my faith. I decided to go, telling myself maybe it had been a misunderstanding, maybe things would calm down. I was wrong. That next Mass, the priest didn't call me out directly, but his sermon was filled with words that cut just as deep. He spoke of vanity, of pride, of women who cared more about appearances than about holiness. Every sentence felt like it had been crafted as a weapon aimed at me. I sat still, staring at my hands folded tightly together, but I could sense heads turning, eyes glancing toward me, as if to confirm I was the sinner he described. My face burned, my chest tightened. My ears buzzed with the sound of whispered comments around me. When the service ended, I walked out quickly again. But this time a group of women at the door kept their voices low, yet not low enough. "She keeps showing up. Shameless. It's almost as if she enjoys the attention." Their words stung more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just the priest anymore. It was the whole community slowly turning against me. At the market, the same looks followed me. Some avoided me entirely, as if approaching me might taint them. Others stared too long, letting their judgment speak without words. Even the children, with their innocence, repeated phrases they had overheard at home. "Teacher, why does Father say some people give bad examples? My mum says you should cover up more." I smiled gently at them, not wanting to burden their young hearts. "Sometimes adults make mistakes too," I told them softly. "What matters most is to treat others with respect and to keep a pure heart." But inside, my heart broke a little more each time. At home, I filled page after page of my blue notebook. I feel like a stranger among my own people. My crime is existing as I am. Lord, help me not to hate myself. Julia, my closest friend, became my anchor. She would visit me after school, sit beside me and listen. She didn't offer easy answers. She offered presence. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Don't let them put out your light. Your faith is stronger than their judgment." Her words kept me afloat, but the weight I carried each day felt heavier. One Wednesday evening, I gathered my courage and went to the parish rosary. I told myself maybe in prayer I would find comfort, but the moment I stepped into the chapel, I felt the eyes again. No one sat beside me. The prayers rose, but so did the whispers. How dare she still come? She really has no shame. At the end, a woman leaned close and hissed in my ear, "For everyone's peace, you should stay home." I walked out, tears clouding my vision. That night, my mother held me close and whispered words I never forgot. "My daughter, remember this. Even Jesus was rejected by his own." Her voice soothed me, but the wound was still raw, and the weeks went on like this. Small cruelties, one after another, slicing deeper than any single blow could. A neighbor turned her face away when I greeted her. Another told me flatly, "Clara, be humble, obey the priest, and all this will end." But my soul resisted. I knew bending would mean betraying my own dignity. Then one Sunday, the priest's words grew harsher. His homily thundered about wolves among the flock, about diseased sheep who endangered the rest. He declared they must be kept away to protect the community. A woman nearby leaned toward her daughter and whispered, pointing at me, "See, he's talking about her." My throat tightened. My fingers gripped the wooden pew so hard my knuckles turned white. The days after were worse. I found an anonymous note slipped under my door, "Leave before God punishes you." My blood ran cold as I read it. I tore it up, but the words stayed burned in my memory. At school, I overheard two colleagues whispering, "It's not right that she keeps showing up like nothing happened." Yes, she should be ashamed. I walked past them, pretending not to hear. But later, in the bathroom, tears streamed down my face in silence. My blue notebook became the witness of all I couldn't say aloud. They want to erase me, but I resist. Even trembling, I resist. And yet, through all the isolation, a small voice inside whispered, "Hold on, don't give up." The next days stretched like a tight wire. I walked across them carefully, afraid that one wrong step would send me crashing into the same humiliation again. Yet somewhere inside me, a quiet stubbornness kept me upright. I went to work. I cooked for my mother. I watered the little plant on the windowsill that still leaned toward the light each morning. I envied it for knowing, with such certainty, where to turn. The whispers followed me beyond the church walls. At the bakery, the woman who used to tell jokes while bagging my bread now counted my change, with her eyes fixed on the till. At the pharmacy, two neighbors broke off their conversation when I came near, then restarted it in a lower voice 3 steps later. The air around me felt crowded with sentences that no one wanted to finish out loud. I told myself to breathe, to count small proofs that ordinary life still belonged to me, the warm crust of the loaf, the smell of laundry drying by the window, the way sunlight slipped across the floor in the late afternoon, like a blessing no one could confiscate. But every proof had a shadow. For each kindness there was a rumor, for each simple moment, a reminder that I had been measured and found wanting by voices louder than mine. At school, the children's questions multiplied, not cruel, only eager, hungry to understand why grown-ups did what they did. One boy raised his hand after math and asked, "Teacher, is there a rule for how you're supposed to be to talk to God?" Another, a girl with a ribbon that wouldn't stay tied, waited until the others had left to say, "My grandma thinks you're brave. My mom says you're stubborn. Which one is true?" I smiled and told her, "Sometimes the same action looks different from different distances. Try to stay close to kindness. From there, things make more sense." I wrote that sentence down later in my blue notebook, not because I was proud of it, but because I needed to hear it again myself. The notebook was becoming a kind of second spine, thin, flexible, and somehow strong enough to hold me up when my own courage bent. On one page I copied down short prayers. On another I taped the corner of a paper bag where a stranger had scribbled, "God sees the heart." On a third I dared to write a question I hadn't wanted to face. What if they never stop? What if this is what church will feel like for the rest of my life? Julia wouldn't let that question become my answer. She dropped by with bread one evening and stayed to help me hang clothes on the line. We moved together in a quiet choreography, clip, fold, shake, clip, until she said almost casually, "Would you come with me to the women's group tomorrow?" Not to speak, to listen. I wanted to say no. My skin still felt thin, and rooms full of people were rough on thin skin. But I said yes, because saying no to every open door is its own kind of prison. The parish hall smelled like chamomile tea and old wood. The women sat in a loose circle, not quite touching. We talked at first about everything except church. The price of eggs, the ache in a wrist, a child who wouldn't sleep through the night. Then the conversation curved without warning, as conversations do, toward what had happened. It wasn't a tribunal. There were no verdicts. One woman simply said, "I felt afraid for her." Another whispered, "I felt ashamed of myself." No one asked me to recount anything. No one asked me to justify myself. Someone passed a plate of cookies and forgot to take one for herself. I realized, sitting there with my hands quiet in my lap, that a different kind of church was possible, one that grew between people in rooms without marble or candles, in murmurs of honesty, in pauses long enough to make space for tenderness. I didn't cry. I just breathed deeper than I had in weeks. Not everyone softened. A few days later I found a new message under my door, written in the same hard pencil as before. "If you had shame, you would stop coming." I carried it to the table, set it down, and stared at it for a long time. Then I slipped it into the notebook with the others. I didn't want to keep a museum of cruelty, but I needed a record of the weather I had walked through, to remind myself later that it hadn't been a fever dream. By then, the shawl basket had appeared at the church entrance. A little sign announced, "For those who forgot." I touched the edge of a folded shawl once, as if I could read in its threads whether this gesture was meant to protect or to accuse. The yarn scratched my fingers. I stepped past it. A printed notice went up on the bulletin board too, guidelines about sleeves, necklines, hemlines, fabrics that should not cling, colors that should not shout. At the bottom, one line in smaller letters, in response to recent events. I didn't need a mirror to know whose reflection they were referencing. There were countercurrents, though, small, stubborn kindnesses that kept me from collapsing into bitterness. Doña Marta pressed an orange into my hand with a gruff, "Keep your strength," as if the fruit knew something about endurance that I didn't. The elderly sacristan nodded at me and said, "God's breath is quieter than ours. Do not mistake silence for absence." A teenager whose sneakers were splitting at the seams sat beside me at the Wednesday rosary without a word, like an anchor quietly dropped. One evening, on my way home from school, I found myself walking slower than usual, as if the street had grown longer. The sky was a flat, watered-down blue. An old man watered his plants by the curb and nodded to me. I nodded back and kept moving, but the simple civility of his nod felt like a rope I could hold for a few steps more. The phone buzzed late that night. The parish council had scheduled an extraordinary meeting for Thursday to address situations affecting unity. The words were careful, as if they had been ironed flat. I sent a screenshot to Julia. She replied almost immediately, "I'm going with you." I set the phone down and watched the light fade on the ceiling until the room went as dark as ink. In the days before the meeting, I practiced saying nothing. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the discipline of allowing other voices to do their own work. If there was any chance the community could correct itself, I wanted to give it room. I wrote instead a list in my notebook, not of accusations but of sensations, the feeling of a wooden pew under my palms, the sound of one cough after a tense sentence, the way my mother's hand rested on the table between us like an anchor that never complained about being heavy. On the morning of the meeting, I went through the motions of ordinary life. I marked a stack of spelling tests. I reheated soup for lunch. I tied my hair back twice because the first time came out uneven. As I reached for my coat, my mother appeared in the doorway. "You don't have to be steel," she said, as if she had heard a thought I hadn't spoken. "You only have to be yourself." I kissed her cheek and tucked those words into my pocket like a folded note. We arrived at the parish hall early. The room wore its usual tired yellow lighting. The chairs were arranged in a near circle that didn't quite close. The priest stood near the folding table with a stack of papers. He greeted us with a curt nod, as if nods could be rations. People trickled in. Familiar faces, hesitant ones, a few curious stares that made no effort to disguise themselves. The meeting began with a sentence about order and example. Then other sentences joined it, some polished, some stumbling, some spoken with the kind of sincerity that leaves the throat raw. A woman with silver hair spoke first. "Since that Sunday," she said, "I haven't dared to approach the altar. I keep wondering what I've done wrong that no one can see yet." A young man from the choir spoke next. "My friends stopped coming. They say prayer feels like judgment now. I don't know how to invite them back." A catechist confessed, "The children asked me why Jesus would let someone be shamed in front of everyone. I told them about truth and discipline, but it scraped against something inside me." I listened. I pressed the spiral of my notebook into my palm and let their words settle in me. It was not victory, it was air. There is a difference. When the priest spoke, his words were the old words: order, discipline, duty, but they didn't land the way they used to. Perhaps it was the room, or the hour, or the tremor at the edge of his sentences that hadn't been there before. He did not look at me as often. He looked at the floor. He looked at the clock. He looked at the door. I said very little. When a pause opened like a soft space, I stepped into it with one simple line: "Correction does not need an audience to be true." The room held that sentence the way a palm holds water, carefully, briefly, as if aware of how easily it could spill. No one argued. No one applauded. The moment passed, and the meeting wound down without decisions, because real decisions take longer than one night. Afterwards, on the steps outside, people moved in small clusters toward the street. A few nodded to me, small acknowledgements that didn't pretend to be anything more. Julia squeezed my arm. "You did exactly what you needed to do," she said. I shook my head. "I did almost nothing," I answered. "Sometimes almost nothing is the right size," she said back, and I wrote that down as soon as I got home. The days that followed were not sudden sunlight. They were a thinner fog. The parish messaging group still sparked with friction. Some posts clanged like lids, others sounded like prayers, but the absolute certainty that had weighed on everything began to crack. You could hear the crack in the pauses between statements, in the way people cleared their throats before speaking, in the way some sentences trailed off without period or exclamation point. One Sunday morning, an elderly priest visited. He preached gently about table and mercy, about listening before speaking, about the difference between firmness and hardness. He didn't mention names. He didn't need to. The words fell like warm rain. The church smelled like polish and lilies. People breathed more deeply than they had in a long while. I went home and wrote, "A different tone changes the shape of a room." I underlined it twice. Then I sat with my mother, and we ate in companionable quiet. After lunch, I washed dishes, rinsing each plate slowly, feeling the water warm my wrists. Ordinary actions have a way of stitching a person back to herself. That afternoon, I felt the thread catch. But even tenderness cannot finish a story that is still unfolding. A few messages arrived that week insisting the priest had done nothing wrong, that softness was simply weakness in church clothes. I didn't argue. I peeled potatoes. I graded homework. I said the rosary out of rhythm and didn't scold myself for it. That Wednesday, I tried the chapel again. The girl with the splitting sneakers appeared at my side, as if she had been waiting there all along. She didn't look at me. She just sat and let her shoulder lean the smallest degree in my direction. The beads clicked in our fingers. Breath by breath, the prayer became less about words and more about the willingness to be present. When I got home that night, I didn't open the notebook right away. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the neighborhood. Dogs arguing 2 streets over, a bicycle's chain, a distant television playing a game show with canned laughter. Life was messy and uncoordinated and stubbornly alive. Eventually, I picked up the pen and wrote, without embellishment, "If he calls my name again, I will not stay silent." I stared at the sentence until the ink dried, then closed the notebook and placed it under my pillow like a promise I didn't want to misplace. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. The light was thin and grey. I brewed coffee and poured some for my mother. We didn't talk about Sunday. We didn't talk about rules. We talked about the neighbor's cat that kept slipping into our yard to nap in the warm dirt. It helped, this detour through ordinary things. It reminded me that the world is wider than any room where a single voice tries to grow larger than it should. On Friday, I saw the priest walking alone across the square. For one heartbeat, I thought about calling out to him, asking for a conversation that was not a performance. But the moment passed like a bird changing direction mid-flight. He turned down a side street, and I kept going. Maybe that talk would come later, maybe it wouldn't. Not everything needed to be forced into the shape of an answer. Saturday evening I set out the clothes I would wear the next day, not as armor, not as provocation, just as myself. A simple skirt, a clean blouse, shoes I could stand in for an hour. I brushed my hair, I folded a sweater over the chair in case the church was cold. I wrote one last line in the notebook before I turned out the light. Being honest is not the same thing as being loud. On Sunday, I left home early. The streets were quiet, rinsed with a pale wash of morning. As I reached the church steps, I felt the old fear uncoil in my stomach, that reflex that wanted me to sit in the back and make myself small again. I paused. My hands were steady, my knees were not. I put one hand on the cool stone of the wall and let my breath catch up with me. Then I stepped inside and chose a pew in the middle, exactly where I used to sit before all of this began. The wood was smooth under my palms. The light coming through the window made a faint pattern on the floor like shallow water. People filtered in. Some looked, some didn't. I felt my heart climb into my throat when the organ fell quiet and the priest moved toward the pulpit. I didn't know what he would say. I didn't know how the air would feel in the seconds after his first sentence. I only knew one thing, with a clarity that felt like a hand laid gently on my back. If my name left his mouth again, I would answer with my own voice, and the voice would be mine, not sharpened by anger, not thinned by shame, only steady enough to be heard. That knowledge didn't make me fearless. It made me ready. And readiness, I was learning, is sometimes the first door that opens when all the others have been slammed shut. I folded my hands. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat and pictured the small plant on the windowsill, turning toward the light. The organ released a single chord. The church inhaled. I lifted my head and faced the altar, not as a problem to be solved or a lesson to be taught, but simply as myself, someone who had decided, at last, not to disappear. And in that quiet decision, before any word was spoken from the pulpit, something inside me moved from breakable to brave. It wasn't a victory anyone else could see. It wasn't a headline or a scandal or a speech. It was the first true turn in a road I hadn't chosen, but would now walk with my own feet. The following Sundays became a series of battles I had never agreed to fight. I entered the church with a quiet determination, telling myself that faith was stronger than fear, but every step across the threshold felt like stepping into hostile ground. The pews no longer seemed like seats of refuge. They were rows of judgment, lined with eyes ready to measure whether I belonged. The priest never called my name again, not directly. He didn't have to. His words were sharpened arrows, carefully aimed but never labeled, so that anyone could pretend they were general statements, except that everyone knew they were meant for me. One Sunday, he preached about the dangers of pride. He described women who sought attention, who dressed in ways that distracted from holiness. Each phrase was like a blow, each pause a moment where the silence itself pointed toward me. People turned, subtly, but I could feel the shift of the air as their gazes cut across my shoulders. I sat still, as if frozen in amber, my breath shallow. My hands clenched my skirt beneath the pew, hidden from sight, while my ears burned red with shame. He never said my name, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew who the sermon was about. The whispers began as soon as the final hymn ended. She doesn't listen. She's stubborn. Maybe if she repented, Father would forgive her. I walked out with my head held higher than I felt, my stomach twisted, but I refused to let them see me bend. At the marketplace that week, I noticed the difference. Where once neighbors greeted me with warmth, now their smiles carried edges. Some didn't greet me at all. Conversations stopped when I approached. A friend who used to share recipes with me turned her back, pretending to inspect tomatoes until I passed. The isolation was no longer subtle. It was deliberate. Even the children in my class repeated fragments they had overheard at home. My mum says, "Father talks about you. They say you don't respect the church." I smiled at them, hiding the ache in my chest. "Sometimes adults say things when they're upset," I told them softly. "It doesn't mean they're right." But inside, I wondered how long before these children, too, would see me only through the lens of scandal. Julia remained by my side. She refused to let me drown in silence. One evening, as we sat in my kitchen with mugs of tea, she said, "They're trying to break you by isolating you. Don't let them. Keep showing up. That's your strength." I wanted to believe her, but every Sunday grew heavier. One week, the priest thundered about wolves disguised as sheep. He warned that those who refused correction endangered the entire flock. His voice rose, his finger stabbing the air. I felt the congregation's eyes press against me, some with pity, others with disgust. A mother leaned toward her daughter and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "He means her." My throat tightened, my vision blurred. I gripped the pew so tightly my knuckles turned white. The following day, an envelope appeared under my door. Inside was a scrap of paper with only a few words, "Leave before God punishes you." I sat on my bed, staring at the note until the letters swam before my eyes. My chest felt like stone. Fear crawled into me, cold and sharp. I folded the paper and slipped it into my blue notebook alongside the others. The notebook was no longer just a journal. It was becoming an archive of every wound, a testimony in ink and scraps. At the grocery, an old acquaintance muttered as I passed, "Some people don't know their place." At the pharmacy, two women whispered near the shelves, "She should be ashamed." Shame left her long ago. The words wrapped around me like chains. I tried to breathe through them, tried to remind myself that my worth was not measured by their opinions, but the weight of their judgment pressed heavier each day. In class, one boy asked, "Teacher, why does Father call people wolves? Are there wolves in church?" His innocent confusion pierced me. I forced a smile. "No, my dear. Sometimes people use strong words when they are upset. But God doesn't call us wolves. He calls us children." The boy nodded, reassured, but my heart broke silently inside. Each night I wrote, filling page after page in my notebook. Today they called me a wolf. Today they prayed as if I were a disease. Lord, do you still see me? The priest's sermons grew harsher with each week. He spoke of scandals, of the rot that spreads if not cut away. He said the community must be vigilant, must protect itself from those who pretend to be devout while leading others astray. Every word was a dagger carefully pointed, and each one left a scar on my soul. Julia tried to keep me steady. "He's showing his fear," she said. "If he were truly strong, he wouldn't need to humiliate you again and again." But strength didn't matter when the community stood against me. One Sunday, as I walked to my seat, two women shifted away, leaving a gap on the bench rather than sit near me. Their gestures screamed louder than words. "You don't belong." After Mass, a man approached me at the door. His voice was low but sharp. "Why do you keep coming back? Don't you see you're tearing us apart?" I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came. My voice died in my throat, strangled by the weight of their contempt. That night I wrote, "Even silence feels dangerous now, but if I speak, will they hear me, or will they crush me harder?" My mother saw the lines on my face deepening. One evening she touched my shoulder gently and said, "Daughter, even Christ was rejected by his own. Do not confuse their rejection with his." Her words soothed me, but the wounds were raw, bleeding beneath the surface. One Wednesday I went to the parish rosary, hoping for a quiet hour of prayer. I sat alone, beads slipping through my fingers, the rhythm of Ave Maria a fragile shield. But even there, whispers coiled around me. "How dare she still come? She pollutes the prayer." And when the rosary ended, a woman leaned close, her words hissing like venom. "For everyone's peace, stay home." I stumbled out into the night, my eyes wet, my chest hollow. At home, I collapsed on my bed and let the tears come. I prayed through sobs, begging God to remind me I still belonged to him. And yet, beneath the grief, something small and stubborn still lived, a flame not easily extinguished. It whispered, "Hold on, you are not what they say." But with each passing week, the storm grew stronger. The weeks dragged on, and every Sunday felt heavier than the last. Each step into the church was an act of defiance, though I never wanted it to be that way. I wanted faith, not war. Yet war seemed to rise around me with every hymn, every sermon, every glance that lingered too long. The priest spoke with a sharper edge now. His homilies were no longer subtle. He warned against decay that spreads if tolerated, against the bad seed that poisons the soil. People didn't need to guess anymore. They knew who he meant. Sometimes he looked directly at me when he said the words. The congregation absorbed his anger like dry ground drinking rain. Some nodded, murmuring their approval. Others avoided my eyes, their silence an agreement in disguise. Each word from the pulpit was not just sound, it became action. Whispers turned into distance, distance turned into exclusion, and exclusion turned into open hostility. One Sunday, I tried to join a group in prayer after the service. As I approached, the circle shifted slightly. A woman placed her hand on the shoulder of the person next to her, closing the space so I couldn't enter. My heart stung. I walked away, pretending not to notice, but the rejection clung to me like a second skin. At the market, people no longer whispered only behind my back. One woman muttered as she passed, "She brings shame on us all." Another, louder, said, "Father is right to protect us." Their words were thrown like stones, small, quick, leaving bruises no one else could see. Julia remained my refuge. "They are building their walls higher," she said one evening, "but walls don't last forever, they crack. And when they do, truth gets in." I wanted to believe her. But when I walked through the square and felt children point at me, giggling nervously, I wondered if those walls weren't stronger than I was. One afternoon, I overheard two colleagues in the teacher's lounge. "She should resign. It's too much scandal. How can she teach morals to children if she can't follow them herself?" I left quietly, carrying their words like daggers. In the bathroom, I pressed my hands against the sink and stared at my reflection. My face looked older, my eyes tired. But beneath the exhaustion, I still saw a flicker of resilience. I whispered to myself, "You are not their words. You are not their judgment." But the fear was real. Every new note under my door made me jump. Some were vague threats, others scripture twisted into condemnation. I collected them all in my blue notebook. They became proof, not for anyone else yet, but for myself, that I wasn't imagining the cruelty. It was real. It was systematic. The shawl basket at the church door remained. Some women used it deliberately, pulling a shawl over their shoulders with exaggerated gestures as they glanced in my direction. A silent performance, meant to show that they were different from me. I forced myself to walk past without flinching, though inside it felt like another slap. Then came the council meeting. Word spread quickly. The parish leaders would gather to address the recent disturbances. Julia insisted on coming with me. My stomach churned the whole day, my hands damp with sweat. The hall was full. Familiar faces filled the seats, eyes darting between me and the priest. He opened with formal words about unity, about preserving the integrity of the church. His voice was controlled, but underneath I heard steel. Others spoke. Some defended him, insisting that rules were rules, that discipline was necessary. But then, unexpectedly, new voices rose. Doña Teresa, frail and trembling, stood. Since that day," she said, "I'm afraid to approach the altar. If she can be humiliated, what about us?" A murmur rippled through the hall. The priest shifted uncomfortably. Then a young man from the choir spoke. "My friends have stopped coming," he admitted. "They say prayer feels like judgment now. I don't know what to tell them." A catechist added, her voice quivering, "The children asked me why Jesus would let someone be shamed. I spoke of discipline, but it felt wrong. It felt empty." I sat frozen, overwhelmed by the courage of their words. For the first time, I realized I wasn't entirely alone. When they asked if I wanted to speak, I hesitated. My throat was dry, my palms slick. Finally, I said, "Correction does not need an audience to be true. It only humiliates when it forgets compassion." The silence that followed was deep and thick. No one argued. No one applauded. It was as if the air itself had shifted, if only slightly. The meeting ended without resolution, but the cracks had begun to show. People left in small clusters, whispering among themselves. The priest's face was tight, his jaw clenched. I knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning. The next Sunday, an older priest visited. His homily was different, gentle, careful, full of reminders about mercy and listening. He didn't mention me. He didn't need to. The words felt like sunlight slipping through storm clouds. I breathed easier for the first time in weeks, but the relief was short-lived. Some members of the congregation doubled down, saying the visitor was too soft, too weak. They insisted our priest was right to be firm. Their voices grew louder, as if desperate to drown out the possibility of change. That week, another note appeared. "Weakness spreads. You are the weakness." I folded it carefully and slid it into the notebook. My hands no longer trembled. Instead, a strange calm filled me. Anger and grief still lived inside me, but alongside them now was determination. I wrote in bold letters across a blank page, "If he calls my name again, I will not stay silent." The words stared back at me, sharp and steady. For the first time, I felt something shift inside, a readiness not to fight but to stand. And I knew deep in my bones that the real confrontation was coming. The storm that had been building was about to break. I knew from the moment I opened my eyes that Sunday morning that the day would not end quietly. Sleep had been shallow. broken by fragments of dreams where voices accused me, pointing fingers merged into shadows, and the church bells rang not to call but to condemn. I woke with sweat at my temples, heart racing as if I had run a great distance, though I had not moved at all. I sat on the edge of my bed and pressed my palms together. My fingers trembled, but my breath slowly steadied as I whispered words I had said every morning since the humiliation began. Lord, do not let me disappear. I dressed carefully, but not extravagantly. A skirt that reached below my knees, a blouse that was plain and clean, shoes I had polished the night before, nothing that could be mistaken for vanity. Still, as I looked in the mirror, I saw more than clothes. I saw armor, fragile and thin, but armor nonetheless. My mother made coffee in the kitchen. She poured a cup and placed it before me without words. Her silence was not indifference, it was solidarity. Before I left, she touched my cheek and whispered, "You don't have to be louder than him. Just be true." The walk to church felt like a march towards something inevitable. The streets were hushed, as if the town itself knew what was coming. When I reached the steps, people were already gathering in clusters. Conversations stopped when I approached, their voices tapering off like water cut off at the source. Their eyes followed me, some with pity, others with suspicion, most with judgment sharpened by weeks of whispers. Inside, the church was fuller than I had ever seen it. It seemed as though even those who had long stopped attending had returned, drawn not by devotion, but by the promise of spectacle. I felt like a lamb entering a ring surrounded by wolves. I sat in my usual place, refusing to retreat to the back, though my knees trembled so hard the pew shook. Julia slipped into the space beside me. She did not speak. She simply reached for my hand, and I held it tightly, as though it were the only rope keeping me from being swept away. The hymns rose and fell, but the notes felt hollow, as if sung out of duty rather than joy. I mouthed the words, unable to trust my own voice. My eyes stayed fixed on the crucifix above the altar, searching for strength in the outstretched arms of Christ. Then came the sermon. The priest ascended the pulpit with a deliberate calm. His cassock flowed behind him like a dark shadow. He set his hands firmly on the lectern and let his gaze sweep across the congregation before beginning. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "today we must address the danger that threatens the purity of our community." His voice was steady, but beneath it I felt the tremor of anger disguised as righteousness. He spoke of discipline, of obedience, of the need to protect the young from scandal. He warned against false humility and arrogance disguised as dignity. Every phrase was a stone laid carefully to build a wall between me and everyone else. I kept my eyes lowered, staring at the worn grain of the pew in front of me, but my ears could not escape. Every word pierced me, burrowed deep, twisting like a knife. "Some," he said, his voice rising, "have been corrected again and again, privately, patiently, mercifully, yet they persist in their defiance. They wear immodesty as if it were righteousness. They confuse stubbornness for faith, and in doing so, they endanger the very souls of those who look to them as examples." The congregation shifted. Whispers rippled through the pews. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against my skin. My cheeks burned, my chest tightened, but I did not move. "Correction ignored becomes rebellion," he thundered, "and rebellion against the shepherd is rebellion against God himself." He paused, letting the words settle like ash after a fire. Then his eyes locked on mine. "Clara," he said, his voice sharp and cold, "stand." A collective gasp swept the church. My heart lurched so violently I thought I might collapse. Julia squeezed my hand once, silently asking me if I was strong enough. I let go, inhaled, and rose to my feet. The church seemed to tilt as I stood. The faces blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. I felt naked, stripped of every defense, as though the air itself had turned against me. "You were warned," the priest said. His tone was not pastoral. It was prosecutorial. "You were counseled, yet you persist. You dress without modesty. You sit in defiance. You dare to lift your voice as though you were the equal of those entrusted with authority. I clenched my fists at my sides. My legs trembled, but my spine straightened. I lifted my chin, and for the first time I spoke. Why? My voice was small, but clear, carrying in the silence. Why do you do this to me? What sin have I committed that deserves such shame? The congregation murmured. Heads turned, some leaned forward, others recoiled. The priest's face tightened. Because you lead others astray, he said. Because you confuse dignity with pride. Because you scandalize the faithful. My clothes are clean, I said, my voice steadier now. My heart is devoted. Does God measure skirts more carefully than he measures mercy? The murmur grew louder. Someone whispered, "She's right." But the voice was drowned out by others muttering prayers under their breath. The priest's hand slammed against the lectern. "This is not your place to question," he barked. "You sow rebellion in the house of God." "This is not rebellion," I answered, my voice trembling but firm. "This is survival. You strip me in public, call me wolf, disease, rot, and yet I remain. Is persistence in faith now a sin?" A hush fell so deep I could hear the flicker of candles at the altar. The priest's eyes blazed. "You are forbidden to approach this altar," he declared, his voice ringing out like a verdict. "Until you repent, you are barred from communion. If you attempt to receive, you will be refused before all." The words crashed over me like a wave, but I did not sink. Instead, I felt something within me harden, a core of steel I had not known existed. "Then refuse me," I said softly. "But remember this. Christ welcomed those you now cast out. He ate with the despised. He touched the unclean. He lifted the fallen. You call this protection. I call it humiliation." The silence that followed was electric. People stared at me with wide eyes. Some shook their heads in horror, others in awe. Julia's voice, low but fierce, reached me. "You are not alone." The priest's face was red with fury. "Sit down," he ordered. I remained standing a moment longer, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. Then slowly, I lowered myself back onto the pew. My hands shook violently in my lap, but my heart pounded with a strange mixture of terror and triumph. The Mass continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Each prayer, each hymn was strained, brittle, as though everyone knew they had just witnessed something that could not be undone. When the time for communion came, I felt my body move instinctively, my heart crying out to join the line. But Julia's hand pressed gently on my arm. Her eyes told me what my reason already knew. If I approached, the priest would refuse me in front of all, and the wound would deepen. So I remained seated, tears slipping silently down my cheeks as the congregation filed past. Some looked at me with pity, others with disdain, a few with quiet admiration. One young girl met my gaze and nodded, the smallest gesture of solidarity. It was enough to keep me breathing. When the final hymn ended and the dismissal was spoken, "Go in peace," the words struck me like a cruel irony. The congregation spilled onto the steps, voices buzzing with argument, judgment, and speculation. I walked out slowly, Julia beside me, my mother waiting at the gate. The priest's words still echoed in my skull, but so did mine. For the first time, I had not been silent. For the first time, I had asked, why? And I knew, deep in my soul, that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of the storm. The days that followed that Sunday were unlike any I had ever lived. The silence of the town was not the silence of peace. It was the silence that follows an earthquake, when everyone waits to see if the ground will shake again. At the market, women paused in their bargaining to watch me walk past, their eyes heavy with the memory of what they had seen. Some whispered, some shook their heads, some pretended not to notice at all. The air itself seemed thicker, harder to breathe. I moved through it like someone wading in water, each step an effort. At school, the children were restless. They had heard their parents speak, and children repeat what they cannot understand. One boy raised his hand during class and asked, "Teacher, why did Father shout at you?" His voice was innocent, curious, but his words cut through me like glass. I smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes adults disagree. What matters most is that we continue to respect each other." But when I turned to write on the chalkboard, my hand trembled so badly that the chalk squeaked and broke. My notebook filled quickly that week. I asked why. The world tilted. I am still standing. They will not forgive me for speaking, but silence is worse. Even if I am barred from the altar, I will not be barred from God. On Wednesday evening, I went to the rosary. I thought perhaps in the smaller gathering there would be respite, a moment of calm prayer. But as I entered, heads turned. A group of women shifted their chairs slightly, as if the air around me were contagious. Whispers began before the first beads slipped through our fingers. "She dares to show up again. It's shameful. God will judge her." I tried to focus on the prayers, the rhythm of Ave Maria like footsteps in a dark corridor. But each word from their lips carried venom when they glanced at me. When the rosary ended, a woman leaned near and said, "Leave us in peace. Your presence poisons the room." They walked out into the night, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break my ribs. Tears blurred the stars above me. When I reached home, my mother was waiting at the door. She saw my face and opened her arms. I fell into them like a child. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," I whispered. She stroked my hair gently and said, "Even Christ was rejected by his own. Do not confuse their cruelty with his love." Her words steadied me, but I could not sleep. I wrote again, my pen carving into the page. "If they strip me again, I will not be silent. My dignity is not theirs to take." The next Sunday came like a storm cloud on the horizon. I entered the church with Julia at my side. The pews were packed. The air buzzed with anticipation, as though everyone knew another clash was inevitable. The hymns rose, hollow as always, and then the priest stepped to the pulpit. His eyes swept the room and landed on me. I felt the weight of his gaze, the challenge in it. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "rebellion must be answered with truth. Confusion must be corrected with clarity. For weeks, our community has been shaken by defiance. Today, I will speak plainly." He launched into his sermon, each word sharper than the last. He spoke of shame, of corruption, of wolves who refused to repent. He declared that the integrity of the church was at stake, that discipline was not cruelty, but necessity. And then, once again, he looked directly at me. "Clara," he said, his voice echoing through the church, "stand." The congregation shifted, their eyes swinging toward me like a tide. My knees shook, but I rose. The pew pressed against the backs of my legs, grounding me. I lifted my chin, though my heart hammered in my throat. "You persist," the priest said, his words slicing through the silence. "You refuse correction. You dare to speak against authority. Today, before all, I declare, you are forbidden to receive communion in this parish until you repent publicly of your pride and disobedience." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Whispers erupted, some in agreement, others in shock. I felt the heat rise in my face, my hands trembling, but I forced myself to speak. "Repent?" I asked, my voice cracking but clear. "Repent for what? For wearing clothes that cover me? For refusing to disappear? For asking why I was shamed in front of all?" A murmur surged through the church. The priest's jaw tightened. "You endanger souls," he snapped. "I endanger no one," I said. My voice grew steadier. "I pray, I teach children, I care for my mother. If that is danger, then what safety is left in this house of God?" The silence after my words was heavy, suffocating. People looked at me with wide eyes, some horrified, others moved. Doña Teresa's frail voice broke the stillness. "Father," she said softly, "please, this is not right." The priest glared, but her words hung in the air like a bell that would not stop ringing. He slammed his hand on the lectern. "Enough!" he thundered. "Clara, you are not worthy to stand among the faithful. Sit down and do not speak again." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I lifted my voice one final time. "If worthiness is measured by obedience to cruelty, then I accept being unworthy." Gasps filled the air. The priest's face darkened. He turned back to the altar, his hands shaking with fury. I sat slowly, my body trembling, my heart pounding like a drum. Julia's hand found mine again. She whispered, "You were brave." The rest of the Mass passed in a haze. When communion came, I remained seated once more, my tears finally spilling as the congregation filed past. Some looked away, others glanced at me with pity, a few with quiet respect. When the Mass ended, the dismissal words, "Go in peace," rang with bitter irony. Outside, voices clashed. Some accused me of arrogance, others defended me. The crowd was divided, no longer unanimous. As I walked home, the air felt lighter despite the weight in my chest. I had been humiliated, yes, but I had also spoken, and I knew deep within me that the storm was not finished. This was only the beginning of something greater. The fracture had widened, and nothing would ever be the same. The Sunday confrontation did not dissolve when the last hymn ended. It lingered like smoke, long after a fire has burned out. The congregation spilled onto the church steps with words sharp as stones, carried on voices too loud for whispers, but too cautious for shouts. Some left quickly, eager to avoid being seen on either side. Others lingered, drawn to the tension like moths circling a flame. Clara walked out slowly, her steps measured, as though the ground beneath her demanded caution. Julia stayed close at her side, her hand resting lightly on Clara's arm. From a distance, her mother waited, her small figure framed by the sunlit gate. She had watched the entire service, her heart breaking at each word, yet her eyes shone with quiet pride. The crowd parted as Clara moved forward. Some avoided her gaze altogether, shifting aside as though contact might contaminate them. Others stared directly, their expressions filled with disdain, pity, or uncertainty. The air buzzed with conflicting sentences. She should be ashamed. She was brave. She dishonored the priest. She only spoke the truth. For the first time, the congregation was divided. The priest's authority, once unquestioned, now carried cracks visible to all, and those cracks would not easily close. At home, Clara did not collapse as some expected she would. She sat at the wooden table in her kitchen, her blue notebook before her. She opened it to the last page, where she had written, "If he calls my name again, I will not stay silent." Beneath it, she added, "Today, I was not silent, and silence no longer rules me." Her mother brewed tea and placed a cup before her. Julia leaned on the doorframe, watching Clara's pen move. The three women remained in that quiet kitchen for a long time, the silence filled not with despair, but with a strange, fragile hope. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through town. By evening, it was on every lip. Some condemned Clara harshly, saying she had brought shame upon the church and herself. Others, however, spoke with admiration, even envy, that she had dared to question what many had thought but never voiced. In the days that followed, Clara felt the dual weight of judgment and support. At the market, an old man nodded respectfully and whispered, "Courage is not disobedience." Yet not long after, a woman muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Faith is not rebellion." The parish itself began to fracture. Some parishioners stopped attending altogether, claiming they needed time to reflect. Others sought out Clara quietly, offering words of comfort. Doña Teresa, frail but resolute, knocked on her door one evening with a loaf of bread in her hands. "You gave me strength," she said simply. "I was afraid to pray. Now I remember why I must." Clara accepted the bread, her eyes brimming with tears. She had been humiliated, yes, but her words had planted seeds she had not foreseen. Meanwhile, the priest felt his authority slipping. Each sermon grew harsher, as though he could rebuild his crumbling wall with louder words. But the louder he spoke, the more people hesitated, whispering among themselves, questioning quietly what they dared not question openly. His anger, once a weapon, began to expose his fear. Julia urged Clara to rest, to gather strength, but Clara's spirit, though bruised, had grown steadier. "I will not leave," she told her friend. If I disappear, their cruelty wins. My silence would be my defeat. She returned each Sunday, sitting in her usual pew, her presence alone a silent declaration. Some glared, some whispered, some nodded in quiet solidarity. Each week, her courage became harder to ignore. Then came the letter. One afternoon, a messenger from the diocese arrived, carrying an official envelope. Clara opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a notice. The bishop had been informed of the situation and would be conducting an inquiry. The priest had reported her for persistent disobedience and disruption of liturgy. Clara read the words slowly, her chest tightening. "He wants to silence me completely," she whispered. Julia clenched her fists. "Then you must tell your side. He cannot be the only voice they hear." Her mother nodded firmly. "Truth must travel, even if its steps are slow." For days, Clara prepared. She copied pages from her blue notebook, gathering the notes. The anonymous letters slipped under her door, the memories of whispered insults, the moments when the priest's sermons had turned into public attacks. Each word became evidence, not of her defiance, but of her endurance. When the bishop arrived, the parish gathered once more. This time the church felt different. The air was heavy with expectation, but also with tension. People no longer came only to listen. They came to witness, to judge for themselves. The bishop, an older man with kind eyes but a weary expression, listened as the priest spoke first. His words were sharp, accusing Clara of rebellion, of scandal, of pride. He painted her as a danger, a wolf among the flock. When it was Clara's turn, she stood with trembling hands, her blue notebook pressed against her chest. She spoke not with anger, but with honesty. She described the humiliation, the isolation, the cruelty disguised as correction. She read aloud from the notes she had written in the nights of her despair. She showed the anonymous threats slipped under her door. "I am not a wolf," she said softly, her voice carrying in the silence. "I am a daughter, a teacher, a believer. I came only to pray, to belong, to stand before God. But I was turned into a symbol of shame. I was stripped not of my faith, but of my dignity. And yet I am still here. I have not abandoned my faith, though many abandoned me." The congregation listened. Some wept silently. Others shifted uncomfortably, confronted with truths they had ignored. The bishop's face remained calm, but his eyes softened as Clara spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not scold. He only nodded, as though each word was a stone added to a scale he alone could balance. When she finished, the silence in the church was thick, unbroken. Then, slowly, Doña Teresa rose to her feet. Her voice, frail but clear, filled the space. "She has shown more faith than any of us. She has endured shame, yet she prays still. If that is rebellion, then perhaps we have forgotten the gospel." Others followed. A young man from the choir stood and said, "I left because I could not bear the judgment, but her courage brings me back." A mother with a child on her hip whispered, "My daughter asked me why father was so cruel. I had no answer, but now I see." The tide had begun to turn. The priest's face flushed with anger, but his voice faltered when he tried to respond. His authority, once solid, now cracked beneath the weight of doubt. The bishop raised his hand, silencing the room. "Enough," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. He looked at Clara, then at the priest, then at the congregation. "The church is not a stage for humiliation. Correction must be given with compassion, or it ceases to be correction at all." The words settled heavily, like stones dropped into still water. Clara's chest loosened for the first time in months. Tears slid down her cheeks, not of shame, but of release. She had been heard, truly heard. The battle was not over. The wounds remained. But for the first time, light had broken through the cracks, and in that moment Clara understood. The resolution was not only for her, it was for everyone who had watched in silence, who had feared the same humiliation, who had wondered if faith meant erasing themselves. Her courage had given them a mirror, and now they could no longer look away. The inquiry did not end with the bishop's words, but the shift in the room was undeniable. The congregation, once united in silence, now divided into voices, some trembling with guilt, others bold with newfound courage. Clara stood among them, no longer invisible, no longer merely the subject of whispers. She was a voice, a presence, impossible to ignore. The bishop called for a recess. People spilled outside, their conversations colliding like waves against rocks. Some defended the priest with fierce loyalty, insisting that discipline was necessary, that the church must stand firm. Others shook their heads, whispering that compassion had been lost, that Clara's suffering was a wound inflicted not by God, but by men. Clara remained inside, seated quietly on the wooden pew. Her notebook rested in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn edges. Julia stayed beside her, eyes sharp, as if ready to fend off any new attack. Her mother sat behind, whispering prayers under her breath, each word a shield woven of love. When the bishop returned, the church fell into silence again. He addressed the congregation, his voice steady, deliberate. "Authority is sacred," he said, "but authority is not beyond fault. Discipline is necessary, but discipline without mercy becomes cruelty. Today, I have heard enough to see that what began as correction has turned into humiliation, and humiliation has no place in this house." The words struck like thunder. Gasps filled the air. The priest's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he did not speak. His silence was louder than any denial. The bishop continued, "This parish must heal, and healing begins with truth. Father, you have used the pulpit not to guide, but to shame. Clara, you have shown resilience, but your suffering should never have been demanded of you. I will report this matter to higher authority, and steps will be taken. Until then, I instruct this parish to remember, dignity is not a privilege. It is a right given by God to all." The congregation erupted in murmurs. Some clapped softly, unsure if it was permitted. Others wept silently. Clara closed her eyes, the bishop's words washing over her like water after a long drought. She was not vindicated completely. The scars remained, the road ahead uncertain, but she was no longer alone. In the days that followed, the town shifted. Some parishioners continued to scorn her, their loyalty to the priest unshaken, but others approached her quietly in the market, in the square, even outside her home. They offered words of gratitude, of apology, of solidarity. "I left because I feared," said one man, "but now I think I will return." "My children asked why you were treated so harshly," said a mother. "I told them truth is sometimes punished, but now I can tell them truth can also prevail." Doña Teresa visited often, bringing bread, stories, and prayers. Her frailty made her words all the more powerful. "You gave me back my courage to pray. I thought I was too small to matter, but now I know that even the smallest voice can echo." Julia remained a constant presence, her laughter slowly returning, her eyes less shadowed. "You have done what none of us dared," she told Clara one evening. "You forced them to look at themselves. That alone is victory." Clara's notebook continued to fill, but the words changed. Where once she had written fear and despair, now she wrote strength and reflection. "They called me unworthy, but today I see worth in every scar. The altar is no longer a place of exclusion. It is a reminder that I stood, that I spoke, that I remained." One Sunday, weeks after the confrontation, Clara returned to the church. The atmosphere was quieter, subdued. The priest delivered his homily, but his voice lacked the thunder it once carried. He spoke of humility, of listening, of mercy. The congregation listened with mixed hearts, some skeptical, some hopeful, some still wounded. When communion came, Clara remained in her pew. She did not move, not because she feared refusal, but because she was waiting for the moment when her presence would no longer be a test, but a truth. After Mass, people approached her. Not all, but enough. Some apologized with words, others with gestures, as simple as a nod, a smile, or an outstretched hand. For Clara, these were not small things, they were beginnings. Life did not return to what it had been before. The scars of humiliation did not vanish overnight. But Clara walked with a new steadiness, her steps no longer weighted by shame. She had been broken, yes, but also rebuilt. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara sat with her mother and Julia outside their home. The air was warm, filled with the scent of jasmine. Children played in the distance, their laughter carrying like bells. Her mother placed a hand on hers. "You did not only fight for yourself," she said softly. "You fought for all of us. For every woman who has been silenced. For every person who has been made small in the name of faith." Clara looked at the fading light and nodded. "It was never only about me," she said. "It was about dignity, about reminding them that God's love cannot be measured by skirts or silence." Julia smiled. "And now everyone must decide what they will do with what they saw." The night deepened, stars piercing the sky. Clara opened her notebook once more and wrote, "I was humiliated. I was silenced. But I spoke. And because I spoke, others remembered their own voices. That is the miracle." She closed the notebook and looked at the stars. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace, not because everything was fixed, but because truth had been spoken and truth had echoed. The church bells rang in the distance, their sound softer, less harsh. Clara smiled faintly. The fight was not over, but it had changed, and so had she. The story of that Sunday would not be forgotten. It would be told in whispers and in courage, in warnings and in hope, and each retelling would carry the same question, the one Clara had forced into the open with her trembling voice. Why? A question that could no longer be ignored.